For a matrix to have an inverse, it must be square, but not all square matrices have inverses. So you have to be really careful when you're asked to find the inverse of a matrix. If it's not square, you can just automatically say it doesn't have an inverse. So we have some steps here to follow. The first thing you want to do is to augment the matrix with the identity matrix. Then you perform Gaussian elimination like we did in 11.6. And your inverse matrix will end up being on the right. So let's look at this first example. We want to find the inverse. That's what this notation means. A to the -1 means to find the inverse of A. Your goal is to end up with the identity matrix on the left with some numbers on the right. And whatever these numbers on the right are, that's going to be your inverse matrix. So there's another typo. That should be a -6 right there, by the way. So let's augment our matrix with the identity matrix. Now we're going to do those row operations that we learned in 11.6 to put this into the form where the identity matrix is on the left. So it has 1s and 0s on the left, and our inverse will be on the right. Well, remember, the first thing you have to do is get the 1, then the 0, then the 1, then the 0. So in this particular example, we could just switch the rows first. Row 1 and row 2 switch places. If we do that, we already get that 1 where it's supposed to be. Okay. The next thing that we need to do is get a 0 here. So what do you add to 3 to get 0? You need a -3. Multiply it by the row with the 1 in it. Add it to row 2. That'll give you a new row 2. Hopefully you've practiced that last section and you're really, really good at this by now. That means that row 1 stays the same. -3 times row 1 plus row 2. So -3 times 1 is -3, plus 3 is 0. -3 times 2 is -6, minus 6 is -12. -3 times 0 is 0, plus 1 is 1. -3 times 1 is -3, plus 0 is -3. I just want to double check that. -3 times row 1 plus row 2. -3 times 1 is -3 plus 3 is 0. -3 times 2 is -6. 6 minus 6 is -12. -3 times 0 is 0. Plus 1 is 1. -3 times 1 is -3. Plus 0 is -3. Okay, so let's see what we have next. We need to get this -12 to be a 1. That means that we can divide row 2 by -12. That'll give us a new row 2. That means again that row 1 stays the same. That's supposed to be a 1. Divide everything in row 2 by -12. So 0 divided by -12, -12 divided by -12, 1 divided by -12, and then -3 over -12 is a positive 1/4. The next thing we need is for this to be a 0. Well, what do you add to 2 to get 0? -2. Multiply it by the row with the 1 in it, so -2 times row 2, add it back to row 1, and that'll give us the new row 1. That means row 2 stays the same. -2 times row 2 plus row 1. So -2 times 0 is 0, plus 1 is 1. -2 times 1 is -2, plus 2 is 0. We have negative 2 times negative 1/12. Negative 2 times negative 1/12 is a positive 2/12 or 1/6, right? 1/6 plus 0 is 1/6. Negative 2 times 1/4 is going to be a negative 2/4 or negative 1/2. Negative 1/2 plus 1 is going to be a positive 1/2. Now that you have your identity matrix on the left, your right side represents your inverse matrix. Since this was matrix A, our notation is A inverse. A inverse is equal to that matrix, which was 1/6, 1/2, negative 1/12, and 1/4. We have now found the inverse matrix for A.